Hello and welcome to It's a Code U, mental health support for those working in healthcare. This is a podcast created for healthcare employees to explore not only issues relating to mental and emotional health, but also unique challenges that those working in healthcare are faced with. Your hosts are Adina Tucker, a licensed clinical social worker with Dartmouth Health, and Jennifer Hinsey, an MSW also with Dartmouth Health. November is National Family Caregivers Month. So, for today's episode, we are going to talk about being a caregiver for a loved one with dementia. Being a caregiver is so complicated, there can be so many layers to it. Not only do you step into a role of caretaking for usually an older adult, but you've likely had roles with this person aside from being a caretaker, like daughter, son, sibling, grandchild. And relationships also have their own story, both good and bad, prior to stepping into a role as a caregiver, which can make it more complicated. And maybe you have a family you're also caring for, a full time job, and just other responsibilities. So, we're very excited to have our guests here today to help us dive into some of the issues that surround those who are caregivers for loved ones with dementia. Our guest, Meredith Kolodze, is a DSW and an LICSW. She is a dedicated social worker with over 15 years of experience in the field. Meredith has devoted her career to making a positive impact on the lives of older adults. As a program manager at NAMI New Hampshire, she specializes in providing essential training, education, and support to older adults and their families, focusing on mental health awareness and care. Meredith's professional interests are diverse, encompassing support for individuals and families dealing with chronic health issues, end of life issues, caregiver distress, grief, anxiety, and depression. Her empathetic approach and dedication to her field make her a vital resource for those navigating the complexities of mental health and wellness. And thank you so much, Meredith, for being here today. And I will let Pam start us off.
Hi, Meredith. Thanks for joining us. What do you think some of the difficulties are about being a family caregiver that maybe people might not be aware of?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I think that one of the things I hear a lot from folks is that there aren't a lot of resources. And I think that there can be this assumption for folks who have not ever had to step into a caregiving role that our medical system or our insurance system has a lot of tools or resources available for folks. And oftentimes caregivers are potentially managing the day to day, organizing schedules. They might be driving people places. They might be managing medical needs, for something that is if maybe fairly simple, managing medications, all the way to complex medical needs like navigating diabetes care, for example, and that they're often doing these things by themselves or in a silo. And so I think that's one of the big things that I hear a lot is, and oftentimes caregivers that have not had an experience of caregiving prior to this experience may also be surprised at the lack of resources and tools that are out there to support them.
If you think there are some logistical or long term planning type things that you feel like would make life easier when you're caring for a loved one with dementia.
Yes, absolutely. So I think first and foremost is really thinking about the logistics of life. And I think that can be really scary. Actually, just did a workshop last night talking about planning, right? So people get a diagnosis of dementia. Maybe there's some relief. Okay, I know what's going on, right? Maybe it's cut out of left field. But regardless, it's really scary. And people want to know what's going to happen. When's it going to happen? But at the same time, it's also really hard to even imagine what life might be like as this disease progresses, particularly if you have no experience with it. You get this big diagnosis, it totally rocks your world. And then there's this people often saying to you, whether they be social workers or doctors, have you thought about advanced directives? Have you gone to an attorney? And people are like, what? I can't process that. But I think that doing some of that really hard practical planning can be really important. And so things like advanced directives, right? And Post or portable DNR, if that's what they're wanting, estate planning. But then also thinking about from a psychosocial perspective. So, who are my people? Do I have a support system nearby? Can I count on them? Are they available, or are they raising their own kids or working a full time job or traveling? So, really understanding from a practical perspective, like who's there, really taking a good hard look at your home. People often don't want to think about doing anything different until they have to. I think we can all understand that, right? I want to stay in my home. I want to be able to take care of myself. But I think that if you can look at those things early on and get a feel for what are going to be the pain points as this disease progresses. Oh, bedrooms are on the second floor, or we don't have a bathroom downstairs, or it's got my driveway super long and someone needs to plow it. All of these sort of things and I think that stuff can help, right? Because then you're being a little more proactive. You can't prepare for every possible thing that might come down the pike. But if you can do some of those checkbox type things and get them out of the way, it takes that off your plate. But I think it also helps people to then think about what's missing and how do I plan for that moving forward. So if I know that I don't have any support system around me that can be effective and helpful, then I'm going to need to think about who's going to drive me places. Am I going to be able to live in my home? Am I going to need caregivers? Can I afford that? So we can start thinking about those types of decisions rather than making them in a crisis, which I think happens to a lot of folks for a whole lot of reasons.
As you're describing that, I'm thinking it would be good if people could think about these things even before someone got a diagnosis. And I know families often don't want to talk about end of life things or wills or care, any of that kind of stuff. But all of that would be so important just to go along with the things that you just brought up. I don't know how to get that out there, but maybe primary care physicians could start to mention it or something like that. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree that we could be doing a lot more in medical settings, particularly like a primary care office. I used to work with a palliative care doctor, and she talked about planning, end of life planning. And we were doing a lot of work with people who had already gotten a diagnosis and were perhaps nearing the end of their life. But she always would say to people, we don't go buy our shovels in the middle of January in New England. Like, we know that it's going to snow. And so we plan ahead most of the time, right? Maybe we're last minute getting things on occasion, but we really try to be thoughtful. And going to buy that shovel doesn't make it snow more or less, right? It's just simply something that we have if we need it. And so I have found that framing helpful for people. When I talk about advanced directives, I actually have a little picture of a person with a shovel. And I say, this is for anyone 18 and above. And so when I was doing a lot of work like that, in medical settings, I would include the family. If it was a spouse, if there were adult children, I'd be like, hey, have you done your advanced directives? How about we all do them together? And everybody was on board with that, but it normalized the conversation. And then I think that in the community, there's a lot more. There's death over dinner, which is you can organize a dinner basically and start and talk about these things. There's in the Seacoast, I think I can't remember the name of it. There's something like Death and Drinks or something along those lines. They were holding it, I believe, at 3S Art Space. Again, different topics and really aimed at a younger crowd, not someone coming in because they have been diagnosed with a life limiting illness or because they are nearing age wise, perhaps the end of their life. And so I think that some of that normalizing could be really helpful. But I also get it. I've been talking about death and dying for the bulk of my career, and doing my advanced directives made me feel a little less like I was like, I really want, but I know how important it is. And I know that there's a short-term discomfort for knowing that I've got that in place should anything happen.
Yeah, I really love the shovel analogy. I think that kind of takes some of the mystery and stigma and taboo stuff away from it and just normalizes it. So I think that's a great way to describe things, especially to people in New England.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that also it's when people think of it as part of adulthood too, again, like not part of illness, I think there was a story several months ago on WMUR about a mom whose college age daughter was injured in an accident and was like in the hospital. And mom couldn't get any information. She couldn't commute. And they had this whole discussion because, and this is why I really try to normalize it for younger folks too, because this is just being an adult. You have to, maybe as an adult, you get a job and you get a bank account and you have to pay bills and you have to do things you don't want to do. And this is just also one of those things that is part of being a grown up that we don't talk about.
Yeah, I mean, as a side note, because I know you, Adina, have a son who's going to be going away to college. I have a good friend who's an attorney, and she had me set up some paperwork with my daughter when she went to college so that I could be contacted, that I could have communication with them. I don't remember exactly what it was called, but because that's scary. Imagine being a parent and not being able to have any information, but that's a good way also to normalize it because you're dealing with younger people, so it may not be as taboo or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I was going to say my son turned 18 last week and had to go to the emergency room because he passed out at school. And they were like, "You get to sign your own papers today. Mom doesn't sign for you anymore." And I was thinking, oh, wow, okay. But it's something to think about that I would have before Monday never have thought about. Oh, I might not be able to, if something were to happen, I might not be able to get information or know what's going on necessarily. So that's actually super helpful. So, what are some common things to expect as your loved one progresses through dementia?
I think breaking things up, there's the practical things, right? Folks are going to be unable or start losing the ability to do things that they've always done. Unfortunately, that can look very different for different people. It's hard to plan. But we know that with Alzheimer's dementia, for example, that people are going to start losing the ability to complete tasks. And some of it will be because they can't hold it in their short term memory, right? To be able to walk through the steps like they always did. And some of it will be because of maybe like dexterity or ability to see the world, like depth perception and spatial awareness. And so there's some physical things that might impact someone's ability to complete tasks as well. And again, you might see someone who is more forgetful with more recent events and maybe has some less emotional regulation as well. And dementia is tricky because, again, there's a lot of different types of dementia and they can all look a little different. So I'm going to talk about Alzheimer's today when I'm talking about this because of the dementias, this is about 80% of folks. Knowing that there can be some different things that occur for folks. Those really having to think about, can folks complete tasks? Are there things that folks should not do? That can be things from cooking on a stove to driving a vehicle, right? And those are really hard conversations, particularly for folks who want to be independent. And then as a caregiver, you're navigating these changes with your person while also trying to manage your own emotions. This is your spouse, you have decades of history together that is potentially gone or disappearing. Your person is not how they used to be, personality wise, managing your own emotions, your own grief, while also navigating someone who might be dealing with that themselves or not dealing with that, depending on where they're at and what's going on. And then as people progress, they really become more dependent on their caregivers. And again, that can range from things as not being able to get dressed for themselves or not being able to properly choose clothing. So it's 90 degrees outside and I've got my parka on. So not being able to make those judgment calls based upon what's going on in the world. And a lot of caregivers talk about becoming their person's second brain, right? So they're having to manage and really think ahead. Okay, what might be problematic with this, whatever this activity that we have to do is. And so example might be leaving the house, right? We used to be able to get out the door in 15 minutes. And now it might take 2 or 3 hours to do the same tasks that were done in the past because the person may need more reminders or cues. They might need help with some of these things. It can feel very all consuming. And then there is also, again, with Alzheimer's, right? There's the forgetfulness. So a lot of people, everybody's experience, but a lot of people will ask the same question over and over again. And you'll answer them, and then they'll come back 5 minutes later and they'll ask you the same question. It's trying to support that person who is forgetting that it's not their fault. And also in it, navigating your own emotions about the frustration of that. One of the caregivers that I worked with, she was like, I never had kids, but I think this must be what it's like to have a 3-year-old. And she said, and I know that was, I don't want to call my spouse a child, but the repeating of questions, the not understanding tasks can feel like you have to parent your spouse, your parent, your sibling, your friend, whomever you're caring for.
Yeah, and I think you just started to speak to this, but I was going to ask about the grief that comes along with it. I mean, for the caregiver, how do they navigate that?
So I think grief is really interesting in dementia because it falls into that ambiguous grief category. Actually, one of my colleagues at Dartmouth, Dr. Renee Pepin, she and one of her colleagues coined the term dementia grief. And what makes this grief different and unique is that your person is still alive, yet they are not your person. They may not recognize you. They may be completely different personality wise than they were in the past, for better or for worse, but things can change. And a lot of well meaning people will say things like, oh, he's still alive. Aren't you so fortunate that he's still here with you? I lost my husband or I lost my parent. And that really invalidates the experience that someone is having. And frequently, this could be the case for adult child caring for a parent, for a spouse as well. That person may be the person they went and talked to about all of these things too. So they're not only losing the person and having all of these experiences about it, but then they don't have anyone to talk to about it. And I think it's always interesting to me how many people don't think about the experience of watching someone move through Alzheimer's or any dementia as grief. And it is, they do workshops on it. I talk about it. We talk about it in our support groups a lot. And every single time people will say to me, I never thought that I thought about it being grief because again, we equate grief with death. And that's not it. And those of us who work in mental health understand that grief is lots of things, right? It's not just someone dying, but our cultural narratives are not. And so people feel it's that disenfranchised grief, like I am struggling potentially for years or decades. The average length of time that someone survives from the point of diagnosis of Alzheimer's in particular is 10 years. And many people, many more than that, right? So we're talking like huge spans of time where someone is maybe not allowed to grieve this person because they are sitting right there. Yet that loss is just as profound and in some ways not necessarily worse or better, but it's different than losing someone who has died because there's a finality with death. Whereas with dementia, you know where it's going, but you don't know what it's going to look like as you get there. And you're having to figure that out, kind of write the book as you read it, right?
I hadn't looked at it that way, but that's a good point in terms of grief and giving people permission to grieve as they're going along.
And I think one of the other things that often plays into this as well is we have this vision of, or this narrative rather, of caregivers as being kind and sweet and cheery and capable, which nobody is that ever all the time, no matter what you're going through. But so I think that's another piece too, is if someone is struggling and they want to talk about it, it can feel like, why do you feel that way? And I think many people are well meaning. I don't think that their intentions are bad, but we expect caregivers, particularly women caregivers, and I don't want to minimize the experiences of men caregivers because they have lots of different things that they're navigating. But as women, we're often not allowed to feel things and are told that we're not allowed to feel things. And so being a caregiver is just like what we're supposed to do. And we're supposed to do it with a smile on our face. People don't realize that they feel that they can have grief or anger or resentment or frustration, that those things are allowed and appropriate. And also they don't feel like they can talk about it perhaps to some of the people in their lives.
I think that's a really good point. I think that even caregiving as mothers, it's like some of that same stigma. It made me think of when my son was like 3 and my daughter was a newborn, and I had her in a baby carrier, and we were leaving, I think, Target, and he was running through the parking lot, and I'm chasing after him trying to grab him, and he just decides to roll around in the middle of the parking lot screaming, and this older lady walks by me and she goes, they're going to be out of your house one day and you're going to be sad. And I thought, that is true. But in this moment, I am not enjoying this. And can that just be okay?
Yes. And that's it. Like, it is okay to feel those things. And I always say to people when they push back, I'll be like, so, if this is your spouse, did you ever find your spouse annoying in the amount of time that you've been together? Did you ever get angry at your spouse because they were a jerk? And 99.9% of the time, people are like, of course. And I'm like, okay, that's the same thing. It's different things that you're getting frustrated with. And yes, we can argue that some of it may be out of their control because their brain is changing and is not able to do the things that they did before. But like, it is perfectly okay to dislike what you're experiencing in that moment. Doesn't mean you loved your kids any less or you're not going to miss them any less when they're out of the home. It just means right now, this stinks and I don't like it. And it's really hard. And wouldn't it be nice for someone to just have said to you in that moment and to say to caregivers is, wow, you're doing a great job, or that looks really hard, or do you need any help with that? Can I, or whatever, I think can be really powerful, but that's not always what people get.
Before I came here, part of what I did was caregiver support. And so I worked with a lot. I worked with a lot of older adults, but also a lot of caregivers for older adults. And there was a woman that I worked with who I kept asking to teach a class. She was a former special ed teacher, and her husband was very, very, like, in his career had done all these wonderful things. And physically, he could take off running down the street, no problem. But he was having a lot of dementia symptoms. And she was every time I would call her to check in with her, she'd be like, I honestly approach it like I did with my students. I know he wants to go out the front door, but I can't have him do that. So I've got a dream catcher hanging on the doorknob and he doesn't know what it is. So he'll walk up to it and look at it and turn away. And she goes, and in a couple of months that might stop working and I'll have to figure out something else. And even, she said at a certain point, I couldn't leave him alone while I showered because I didn't know what he might be doing. She was like, so I would say, you know what? I'd really like it if you could read to me. Do you think you could do that? Would you be willing to do that? And he's like, yeah, of course. And so I'd get him one of his engineering books and he'd sit and read to me while I showered. And she's like, he at a certain point he couldn't do all the words, but it was something he really loved. So the pictures and everything else kept him engaged. And she always had all of these. She goes, and then when that stops working, I'll figure out something else. And so she always had really kind of like inventive things. And like when she'd pick him up from, he he would go to an adult daycare type of situation a couple days a week. And on the way home, she'd say, how do we know each other? What's your name? Where where am I taking you home? Where do you know where home is? How old are you? And she said she would do it in a way where it was just like conversational. And she's like, he wouldn't always get all of those questions right, but she wanted to still have his brain working to see like where he was at. And it kind of helped her stay engaged. So I was thinking about that and just wondering what are some of the workarounds or interventions that someone who's caring for a loved one might be able to use with some of the common dementia issues.
Well, first, I just want to say she sounds so creative and outside of the box thinking, and I love all of that. There are lots of different approaches at the Aging Resource Center at Dartmouth Health. We have a program one of my colleagues runs called Savvy Caregiver, and it's an education-based program that helps people learn how to navigate dementia. And one of the things they talk about in there is contented involvement. So giving people tasks and things to do. Like, again, pre all of this, some people might have just liked watching TV, or they might not have been. For someone that was an engineer, for example, who was maybe reading a lot of books or doing a lot of things, like they need some tasks. And they need to feel involved and they need to feel like they have purpose. And all human beings need. Thinking about how do we get creative. And also, oftentimes I think where caregivers get stuck is getting really focused. So that example about the book, right? Like it may be that he's not able to read it, or he might be reading it, but who knows if that's actually what it says. And trying to help people understand that it doesn't matter. If that person is feeling good with that thing that they're doing, whatever it is, don't judge it. Even if their previous self would never have done that, if they're feeling good about it, that's awesome. And so I think getting creative. Another example that came up in one of our trainings was it was a gentleman who had enjoyed mechanic type stuff, cars and tinkering, putting things together, taking them apart. He couldn't do that anymore. But what his family did was they said he always was sorting washers and bolts and screws, right? As just to keep things organized, right? So they literally just got jars, washers, bolts, screws, whatever, and he would sort them. And then they'd pour them out and he'd do it again. And it was twofold. Again, the example that you gave, Adina, right? Like it connected him to his previous life, that tactile feeling of those nuts and bolts, even if he didn't know the words for them or know what they were, that was familiar. It was something that he knew, right? And he was enjoying it. So I think we really encourage people in our support groups as well as in Savvy Caregiver to think about, how do we give people purpose? What does that look like? How do we get past our own expectations of what the situation should be, which again can be really difficult as we see someone declining, and sometimes we feel like we're infantilizing them, and sometimes we might be. And sometimes we are, again, getting creative, sort of thinking outside the box. And then I think the other thing that I appreciated about that example is that awareness that things change. And so what I do today may not work tomorrow. And being prepared for that while also saying it works right now. And so again, we don't have to solve it forever. We just need to solve it for right now. And I think that another thing that can be really beneficial for caregivers is to talk things through with people and who might not be on your same level. So another example that came up not that long ago was a mom, an older adult mom, was having trouble with the temperature in her home. So what was happening is she was like turning it up or turning it down or whatever. And adult children were like, oh, we'll just get one of those temperature thermometers that is taken care of by the phone and it's closed in. You don't have to do anything with it and it just automatically changes things. So that was really confusing for mom. Caused a lot of stress. And brilliant idea. There's nothing wrong with what they came up with, but that was not her experience. And as people lose their more recent memories, right, they might go back to and find comfort in things that were from the past that we may not be doing anymore. And she probably always adjusted the thermostat her entire life, right? Because it's only been recently that we have these new ones that you can do with a phone. I often will encourage people to, like, if possible, talk to someone outside the family or talk to someone who just thinks a little differently than you and walk through this and just see, am I looking at this through my own lens and missing the fact that maybe my person might not be on the same wavelength as I am with this particular situation.
Yeah. The only thing I was going to say is, so I was trying to think, is there anything that we said that maybe people outside of healthcare might not understand, which is just, can you just briefly explain the post and the DNR just for anyone who may not be familiar with those terms?
Yes. Oh, yes. Thank you. So it's funny. I was just in a meeting yesterday and they had like tasks, and one of them was the acronym spotter. And they were supposed to stop the meeting and say, now, what is that? So apparently I needed one of those here. So PULSE is physician orders for life sustaining treatment. I believe in Vermont, it is most medical orders for life sustaining treatment. So same concept. And basically that document it's physician or medical orders that identify some types of treatment that someone might want at a certain point in their disease progression, but it has to do with things like medications or machines. tube feeds or artificial hydration and nutrition. So medical interventions and whether or not someone might want them or not. And so this it allows people to basically get their doctor to sign off on it. And then it's something that can be portable. And so if someone should go to the emergency room, for example, they can have that document and provide it to the emergency room so they know what this person's wishes are. The portable DNR is the do not resuscitate order. This is also a medical order. And this is if someone should not want CPR in the event that their heart stops and they stop breathing. So if the ambulance is called, the default is CPR if someone's heart has stopped. And so some people will choose not to have that. And so they need that documentation as well to basically, and it just basically says to the paramedics or to the medical providers, whomever it may be, that this person had had these conversations and they've identified what they want and the doctor is in agreement that it's appropriate.
Okay, yeah. And I know I was just thinking, like, I know what those are because I work in the hospital, but
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And the other thing too, I will just add, since I was just talking about this last night, it's fresh in my brain, but advanced directives, a lot of folks are familiar with those. We talked about those a little bit earlier. Who's going to make decisions for you in the event that you can't? What types of decisions? Again, it can't cover everything, but it gives some kind of guidance. And then there's a portion specific to end of life and the types of decisions. But Dartmouth actually has, and there's also some other groups that do a dementia directive as well. So it doesn't stand alone. It's not like you have to have it with an advanced directive, but basically it asks questions about similar types of medical questions that someone might want to consider or need to consider. And it breaks it up into different parts of the disease. So if I was in the early stages of dementia diagnosis, what types of care might I want? And some people might say, okay, I want more aggressive care at this point, or I might want antibiotics and to be hospitalized. Whereas as disease progresses, people have an opportunity to think about what is quality of life for me and what would I want. And that document is another one we talked earlier on about what to think about moving forward. It's a great one to do right away, super hard, really emotional. But again, it really gives people some guidance and it helps family and friends, as well as the medical team, to get a feel for what this person might care about, what's important in their life. And then it's also a nice conversation starter too. Like many people don't know how to say, I want to talk to you about my end of life plans, right? That feels really awkward. But I've got this document. Can you look at it? And then can we talk about it? Can maybe be a little bit of an easier conversation.
yeah, I feel like it's like initially one of those things that feels very like, oh, I don't want to talk about this, but it can really take away some of that anxiety around the unknowns because you've already talked about it. You have a plan. If A happens, then B is going to happen and all those kinds of things. So I guess just to wrap up, I just wanted to ask, what is something that you would really want someone who either has a dementia diagnosis and is still coming to terms with everything and everything that that means, or someone who's caring for a loved one with dementia to know?
I think the thing that jumps out at me a lot is, that folks can still live a good life. And I don't say that in this Pollyanna, everything's going to be fine way. But I think that we have a lot of stigma around dementia diagnoses, right? Many folks are very afraid of them. We have a lot of beliefs about what folks who have a dementia diagnosis can and can't do. And I think that one of the biggest worries I hear from both the person diagnosed as well as their caregiver is like, will we be able to live our life? And I'm not going to sit here and say that things won't change and that they won't get harder and that there might be some things that you have to stop doing because then I'd be lying. But I think going back to that example of that special ed teacher, like getting creative can really open up opportunities for people and people live well and and so I think that is one thing. And then I think the other thing is to reach out and connect early. That may be a support group. There are many support groups out there. Aging Resource Center, we do several virtual groups, but there's Alzheimer's Association, and then there's probably like local groups that do them as well. So connecting, if that feels good for you, finding community in that way. getting education. Maybe I'm not the type of person that wants to go sit in a support group and talk about how I'm feeling, but maybe I can learn and get some tools. And then I think making sure that we prioritize ourselves as caregivers. And that can be really hard to do. But I think it's really important. And that again does not mean that you should go to the spa once a week. And that's great. If you want to do that, go for it. But I think again, how we take care of ourselves has to change and shift as our person needs more of our attention. But we can still find those moments and thinking about how do we put things in place in our lives so that we can get as much support as possible as we navigate this because it's really hard. It's hard for everybody.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this came to me and I was thinking about it is that I've seen, well, with my own grandparents as well, but just in people that I worked with, is distraction can be very useful, especially as it progresses. And sometimes things can come up that the person you're caring for perseverates on and is really just distracting them to something else can really be helpful and take away some of that frustration that can naturally come with something that happens over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we don't use distraction enough as a tool. Yes, it can become problematic, right? But it's healthy to shift to other things. We don't You're living in dementia all the time when you're taking care of someone, whether you live with them or whether they're at a facility or whether they live 3 states away, right? Like they're on your brain, right? I think that distraction can be super healthy, right? Again, we can get problematic where we're really trying to avoid everything all the time. And we're going to be thinking about the people that we're caring for, that we love, or that we're worried about, right? But there's nothing wrong with shifting to read a good book or taking a walk. And if the person's frustrated, same thing. Like they may not have that skill set any longer to be able to turn their attention away to something else, but you can help them with that. And there's nothing wrong with it. I think that it can be really helpful. And oftentimes when we get distracted away from that thing we're focused on, and this can happen with our folks with dementia as well as us as caregivers, right? We forget about it. We move on because it really isn't that big of a deal. It's just we can't get out of our heads. So that distraction really allows us to take a different path, and that can be helpful for our people too.
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying all that, I'm thinking I have probably 4 or 5 clients that would really benefit from this information. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm also a big reader. I love books, and there's a lot of people are familiar with the 36-hour day, which is a really good book. But one of the books that really lands a lot in our support group, and I really love it. I shared it recently to a friend whose mom has Alzheimer's, and I have utilized it in my own life dealing with family members with Alzheimer's, is Travelers to Unimaginable Lands by Dasha Kipper. And it's a really great book that just helps, again, normalize the experiences. And so not everybody feels like they can find time to read a book, but if they can, or if they're readers, I know I am, those are a couple of great books as well. So there's a lot of really awesome resources with the advent of computers and things being virtual, right? Like you can access so much more than you used to be able to, which is really beneficial for people who might feel like they can't leave the house all that much, but want the resources and tools.
It's great. And I'll put links to all of that in the show notes for anybody that wants those. We hope that today's episode provided some validation for your experience if you're a caregiver, or some understanding if you have a loved one who is caring for someone, of what their experience might be like. And hopefully, you've gained a few tips of ways to make things easier or different hacks for caregiving. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please reach out to us at dhbhs.media@hitchcock.org. We appreciate you listening, and thank you, Meredith, so much for being here today.